On behalf of the Board of Directors of the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, we want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Heterodox Heels. You'll hear more about that in a moment. The UNC Student Free Speech Alliance, Tomasi, who's the president of that, is here tonight. And also SKILL, the School of Civic Life and Leadership. Did I get that right? Now, UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance is a mouthful, so just call us UNC AFSA. If you remember that, then you can remember our very simple URL for that website. It's uncafsa.org, uncafsa.org. So please go there and subscribe, and that's free. We will not fill up your inbox with requests for money. But we will send you interesting newsletters about the latest news on the free speech front and about our upcoming programs. Our program for January-February timeframe is not set yet, so I can't pitch that. But put April 9th, 2026 on your calendar, because we're going to have a very interesting speaker for our annual meeting, which is Byron York, the Washington Examiner. What do we do at UNC AFSA? We defend free speech, viewpoint diversity, and academic freedom at UNC. We do that by putting on great programs like the one tonight, and by interfacing with leaders at UNC on free speech issues, and by being a watchdog for free speech rights at UNC, and an advocate for viewpoint diversity. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Just go to the website and you might find interesting ways to support us. Let's put it that way. Now, to introduce our speakers, I'm delighted to present Mark McNeely, who is a professor at Keenan Flagler School of Business. Mark holds an MBA with honors, or MBA, explain MBA? MBA with honors from the University of Minnesota. And he is the co-chair of Heterodox Heels, and he can tell us more about that organization. Mark has been a great friend to UNC AFSA from the very beginning. I don't think we would have ever gotten off the ground if it hadn't been for Mark's assistance. So, Mark, come up and speak, please.
Okay, so again, I'd like to join you, John, and welcome you to tonight's event, Trump versus the Ivory Tower, Government's Role in Education. As mentioned, I'm a co-chair of Heterodox Heels. It's a Heterodox Academy campus community. Lawrence Dorr is my co-chair. And the Heterodox Heels is a group of faculty and staff and some students that really are interested in free speech, civil discourse, and viewpoint diversity. And we've been lucky enough to partner with UNC AFSA a lot. So tonight, John Tomasi from Heterodox Academy and Jay Greene from the Heritage Foundation will debate the role of government in higher education reform, moderated by Jenna Robinson, president of the Martin Center for Academic Renewal. John is the inaugural president of Heterodox Academy, which is a nonpartisan membership organization of faculty, staff, and students who want to ensure that our universities are places where intellectual curiosity thrives. Prior to joining HXA, Tomasi held the position of professor of natural theology at Brown University. Jay Greene is a senior research fellow at Heritage Foundation's Center for Education Policy. Prior to his current role, Greene was a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, which he founded and led for 16 years. In addition to being the president of Martin Center, Jenna Robinson serves on the board of the Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, so the national and the UNC, the steering committee of the Bastiat Society of Raleigh, and a member of the board of visitors for UNC at Chapel Hill. Tonight's questions, big question is, can universities reform themselves, or is outside pressure necessary, like that coming from the Trump administration? Beneath this question are three sub-questions. First off, does higher ed need reform? I think there's still debate about that, at least some people think that. If higher ed needs reform, can it reform itself, or is outside intervention from the federal and state governments required? And if outside intervention is required, have the Trump administration's actions been positive, negative, ineffective, or a mixed bag. So before we start, I've got to read a little, just the little saying about how you all have to behave. So the North Carolina Restore and Preserve Free Speech Act, passed by the North Carolina General Assembly in July 7, 2017, requires the university to protect the rights of the audience to see and hear the event, and to protect the right of speakers to be heard and seen, regardless of their viewpoints. Any person who disrupts the event or interferes with the rights of those in the audience to hear or see the speakers will be asked to leave. Anyone who does not leave will, when asked, or does not put down signs which obstruct the audience's view, will be removed and may be subject to arrest. So on that positive note, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna. Do you want to kick it off? And then we'll have those. I think the speakers are going to go first, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, we're just going to start with Jay.
Okay. So thank you all for the honor of being here, and thanks to all of you for showing up. I don't normally write out remarks, but I wanted to be careful, so I did, and I apologize. I know that it's so much more entertaining when someone speaks extemporaneously, but I hope that the message makes up for the delivery. So solutions have to be aligned with the causes of problems. In higher education, the problem is the abandonment of the truth-seeking mission of universities in favor of political activism. The change was caused by highly motivated groups of faculty grabbing the machinery that runs universities and the gateways that produce academics and allow them to advance professionally. In essence, there was a political takeover of the institutions of academia. This hijacking of universities was caused by a political takeover and not primarily by an intellectual error. So the solution to this takeover has to be political. External political and financial force is required to dislodge the radical faculty that have grabbed power. They cannot be argued out of their hold on power. They are not misunderstanding the situation and could be convinced to amend their ways if only it were explained to them properly. This, in a nutshell, is why I believe that Trump's efforts to reform higher education are moving in the right direction, and why Heterodox Academy is mistaken to oppose those efforts. Let's break down each step in the argument I just made to see if I can convince you to draw the same conclusion. I hope that it will not require too much effort to reach agreement on the nature and severity of the problem in higher education. Numerous studies have been done showing the shocking ideological homogeneity among the faculty and staff who run higher education. This severe ideological imbalance has been demonstrated in surveys measuring partisan and policy preferences, party registration, and campaign contributions. Some people respond to this mountain of evidence by saying, well, sure, faculty lean to the left, but they are highly trained professionals, so this does not affect their teaching or research. This claim is as implausible as it is untrue. For example, John Shields and his colleagues recently examined a large sample of course syllabi in which leftist works were assigned to see if balancing texts were also assigned. As you would expect, they were not. Ideological imbalance in the faculty results in ideological imbalance in teaching and research. I'll mention just one more study on ideological homogeneity. In a recent analysis, I looked at campaign contributions from professors in the Ivy League during the 2024 presidential election. In the entire Ivy League, there were only 2 professors who made campaign contributions to Trump, both of whom were at Cornell. At the other 7 Ivy League universities, there wasn't a single professor who contributed to Donald Trump. By comparison, there were around 900 contributions from Ivy League professors to Kamala Harris's campaign. Remember that about half the electorate supported Trump, but in the Ivy League, Harris supporters outnumbered Trump by about 450 to 1. If you accept that ideological homogeneity is a serious problem in higher education, we have to explain what caused it. At the heart of the problem is that the way we run universities makes them particularly susceptible to political capture. Even relatively small but highly motivated groups of faculty determined to hijack universities for activist purposes can and have done so without too much difficulty. This is possible because universities are run as if they were collectives, rather than the nonprofit corporations that they actually are. Faculty have to volunteer or agree to take on the roles to run key functions of the university, which is largely a dreadful and thankless task. Most professors would rather focus on their teaching or research, but the faculty wishing to hijack the university for political purposes readily take on these roles. They serve on the committees that recruit and recommend the hiring of new faculty. They serve on promotion and tenure committees that decide which faculty will be able to remain and be promoted to higher rank, status, and pay. They serve on admissions committees for graduate programs that decide who will be among the future pool of faculty to be recruited. They serve as reviewers at journals that decide which works will be published. They serve on program committees for academic associations that decide which papers will be presented at conferences. As activist faculty grabbed hold of these various choke points, they could favor those who ideologically aligned with their views and shared their priority for activism over truth-seeking. At a minimum, they could seek to punish or exclude those who might object to their political takeover. The disinterest among the rest of the faculty in these academic governance roles allowed this process to continue across several decades. To further solidify their hold on universities, activist faculty pushed to build diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies. The purpose of these bureaucracies is to articulate and enforce an ideological orthodoxy on campus. That way they can apply official sanction to viewpoints that are at odds with those favored by the activist faculty. Groups of radical students contributed to this rise of the DEI bureaucracy by regularly extorting senior leaders with threatened disruption or accusations that might jeopardize the careers of those senior administrators. And to ensure that student radicals wouldn't face punishment for breaking university rules as they disrupted campus and leveled threats, activist faculty took roles on disciplinary committees so that their allied students could be let go with a slap on the wrist. When Heterodox Academy was created about a decade ago, the political takeover of the university was already far along. And while they tried to offer protection to fellow faculty who objected to the takeover, they have more often been defeated than succeeded. They could feel righteous in their defeat, but they didn't even make a dent in reversing the trends I'm describing until Trump became president. But Heterodox Academy is unhappy about Trump's efforts. In a recent piece, Dr. Tomasi wrote, "Deep, lasting internal reform, not punitive or retaliatory government action, is the true path forward for our institutions of higher learning to live up to their ideals. The details of this plan for internal reform are never really described, nor are we provided with examples of how the strategy has yielded significant progress. The problem with this insistence on internal reform is that it ignores the extent to which political capture of the mechanisms governing academia make internal reform impossible. This is not a debate about whether Heterodox's vision is correct. The problem is that numerous checkpoints that control academia have been captured by those who oppose Heterodox's vision of, quote, institutional cultures where open inquiry and viewpoint diversity thrive." We have to think about this like political scientists, not philosophers, because reforming universities is a political, not a philosophical struggle. Now, I hope that I have not described the political takeover of universities in overly dire terms so that you would think that reform is impossible. I actually don't think that. In fact, I think there are important political advantages that reformers have at their disposal to help them recapture universities. First, the activist faculty and their allies in the student body do not constitute majorities in most institutions. A large number of faculty and students resent the activist folks and what they have done to their universities. But given the organizational power held by the activists, they are unwilling to take the risks and exert the effort to challenge them. Without external assistance in improving the odds of success, the cowed majority cannot be expected to commit career suicide to reform universities. Second, The excesses of the activist faculty have exposed universities to enormous political and financial liabilities. For example, activist mobs of faculty, staff, and students have harassed and assaulted Jewish and Israeli students at more than a dozen of our most selective universities, while those institutions have failed in their legal responsibility to abide by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and protect the students being targeted. These are not instances of protected, even if unpleasant, speech. We are talking about severe and repeated harassment and assault. Harvard's own internal investigation yielded more than 300 pages of documented abuse. These include an instance in which protesters blocked and shoved a Jewish student attempting to cross a die-in protest so that he could not return to his dorm, resulting in the arrest of 2 students. But Harvard refused to cooperate with the prosecution of those 2 students, did not impose any punishments on them, and instead rewarded each, one with a major scholarship and a profile on their admissions page, and the other with the honor of being marshal at commencement. In another instance, students occupied a building in violation of university rules at Harvard. Rather than being punished for preventing their fellow students from accessing their education, Harvard administrators delivered burritos and Twizzlers to them in case they were hungry as they occupied the building. Incidents like these were repeated at Columbia, MIT, Northwestern, UCLA, CUNY, New School, and others. If these universities cannot demonstrate that they have remedied the problems and are in compliance with Title VI, they risk losing all federal assistance, from research funds to subsidized student loans. This is an enormous financial liability for these universities. Universities are exposed to these liabilities because they have allowed groups of radical faculty to hijack their institutions to pursue their own political agendas. Those faculty have encouraged groups of activist students to take those actions, and radical faculty control the disciplinary processes that fail to punish the students when they violate the civil rights of their fellow students. While this is terrible, frankly, there is a much more serious and widespread violation of civil rights that activist faculty have promoted, which is improper discrimination on the basis of sex and race in admissions, scholarships, and hiring. As a university administrator myself for 16 years, I cannot sufficiently convey to you how widespread this problem was at my own and every other institution that I knew. Discrimination on the basis of race and sex was so normalized that people talked about it openly and wrote it down frequently in policies, memos, and emails. John Saylor at the Manhattan Institute has been unearthing these documents at university after university, and their contents are devastating. That paper trail is a gigantic headache for senior university leaders and boards of trustees because they know that it documents how frequently they violated the law. Activist faculty who pushed the notion that people classified as oppressors should be treated differently than people classified as oppressed were indifferent to the legal liability that this practice imposed on their universities. There's another matter of political liability. There is no legal requirement for universities to be ideologically balanced, but there is a political cost if universities that depend on Republican support to continue receiving enormous public subsidies if they adopt hostile positions to conservative ideas. Again, activist faculty don't care about the damage it might do to their institutions. They're simply pursuing their own agendas. But senior administrators and boards of trustees are coming to understand what a mistake they made in letting their universities be run as if they were hippie communes rather than nonprofit corporations. The Trump administration has made significant progress in reforming universities by highlighting the legal and political liabilities that universities face and pursuing legal and policy remedies to begin to impose those costs on bad acting universities. I don't want to have to defend every statement or action, but I do think that we have to recognize the gains that have been made in the last year. Universities are rapidly dismantling their DEI bureaucracies. They are adopting revised disciplinary policies to prevent protests that prevent other students from receiving their education. They are eliminating discriminatory practices in admissions, scholarships, and hiring. These gains are uneven and not comprehensive, but they are impressive given how we finally are seeing a reversal of the negative trends of the last few decades. Now, you might think that Heterodox Academy would be happy about this progress, but apparently they aren't. If I were to be uncharitable, I might conclude that they prefer losing. But to give their concerns more credit, let me anticipate and address them. In essence, I think their objection is that even if Trump is making gains, he is doing it in the wrong way by failing to follow the appropriate procedures and infringing on academic freedom. But if you actually read the agreements that the Trump administration has struck with Columbia, Brown, Penn, and the University of Virginia, you will be struck by how everything in them is completely appropriate, and none of it infringes on academic freedom. Those agreements basically consist of pledges by the universities not to engage in discrimination that violates civil rights, methods for monitoring or ensuring compliance with those pledges, and pledges to change administrative procedures and organizational structure regarding student discipline and hiring to reduce the likelihood of future civil rights violations. There is nothing in these agreements that tells universities and their professors what the professors and students can study, what conclusions they must reach from their research, or in any way restrict their freedom of speech. It simply isn't there. Unfortunately, academics, despite their professional obligations to ground claims in facts, repeat the ghost story that Trump is taking over universities with these agreements and is dictating what they can say and do. This is patently false. I challenge everyone to read the texts of the agreements and see if you can find anything in them that would support such hysterical claims. Not only do these agreements contain nothing inappropriate, but frankly, it is the obligation of the executive branch to enforce the law and ensure that universities are fulfilling the conditions of their receipt of public funds. Remember that universities are not entitled to taxpayer dollars. That money comes with legal conditions to comply with civil rights law and political conditions to serve the national interest. The Trump administration has been completely correct in reminding universities of these obligations. But the reality is that senior university leaders and boards of trustees are recognizing the ways in which their institutions have gone astray, but up until now they've lacked the organizational and political strength to recapture key mechanisms of university governance from activist faculty. Ironically, the agreements that universities are striking with the Trump administration are helping them realize reforms that they have long desired but been unable to accomplish. Trump is actually helping the boards of trustees and senior leaders. We don't have to agree with every bargaining position or statement by Trump to recognize the extent to which the involvement of the administration in forcing universities to fulfill their obligations for public funding are helping restore universities to their truth-seeking mission and will enable greater intellectual diversity and discourse in the future. Thanks.
There's a clock right there, so you can.
How long should I talk?
15 to 20.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for coming, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm really delighted to be back on your beautiful campus. As I was listening to Jay, I was thinking at first that he and I share so many premises and disagree on the conclusions. But as he went on and I kept thinking more about what he was saying, I think we may disagree on two key premises. They're premises within social science, I think, but I'll lay that out and you'll see what I mean as I go. So I'm going to unpack the questions that Mark set for us, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time, a little more time than you might expect, on the first question, because I think you'll find some things in that. The first question being, is higher ed in need of reform? I think by pausing on that question and looking into that question a bit, we're going to find something important down the line, so bear with me at first. So, is higher ed in need of reform? There's a first level answer to that question that's easy to skip over, but I think it's worth pausing and attending to it. And so, are universities in need of reform? Well, on the first level, the answer is obviously yes, because universities are institutions. And from a certain Western civ institutional perspective, every institution is constantly in a process of becoming. Nothing in this world is fixed. Nothing in this world is given. Every institution at every time, at every point in its history, is always changing, is always in a process of becoming. There was no golden age when universities were perfect. There never will be a golden age when universities are perfect. Just like there's never been an age in your life when you were perfect, and there never will be an age in your life when you're perfect. It's a feature of Western civilization. One of the deepest sets of principles within Western civilization, though, that despite that imperfection, despite that inevitable fact that we're always in a process of becoming, there was the possibility of making things better. Philosophers call this the doctrine of meliorism. You can make things better, but it's an extremely important doctrine. Meliorism is the idea that through reason, through conversation, through hard, slow, painstaking work, through experimentation, together, we can make our institutions better. So I just want to point out that little first feature about the question, does higher ed need reform? And then now getting more specifically to universities, from that general principle. Some of you probably know about Gallup polls that came out a couple of years ago showing this dramatic decline in public confidence in higher ed. Just a precipitous fall. These polls were coming out before October 7th attacks and the testimony of college presidents on Capitol Hill, which were disastrous by every observer's evaluation. In those testimonies, we saw presidents on stage who had been overseeing the building up of eggshell cultures on their own campuses, who've been allowing shout-downs to happen without any kind of consequences any kind of serious consequences, not caring about free speech, we could summarize in that way. We saw them now when asked, is calling for the genocide of Jews permitted by your student code of handbook, waffling, hiding behind legalese, and basically saying they cared for free speech. They sort of ducked behind the most convenient legal hedge they could find and cowered there. That further eroded the confidence of the public in higher education. And then more specifically in the background leading up to it, in the 1960s, regarding political demographics of the professoriate, in the 1960s, the US professoriate was unbalanced roughly 2-to-1 left to right. Some people think that was an appalling tragedy, but people choose professions for a variety of reasons. It's not completely crazy to think that in a free democratic society, people will choose different professions based on some political ideological views that lead them towards their political party affiliation. But it was about 2-to-1 in the 60s. Now it's about 20-to-1. And in some fields, as Jay well knows, in some fields like sociology and anthropology, it's approaching 100 to 0. So there's been this huge delta, this huge shift of my generation of professors, people who are now watching over their institutions, they're part of this process of things being in a process of becoming, and the change was extremely deleterious to there being any kind of balance, ideological balance within the faculty. That's important, not because it's important to have more Republicans. It's important because monocultures are toxic to the university enterprise. Monocultures allow tribal thinking that humans are always subject to. Monocultures allow groupthink to go on unchallenged. Monocultures are toxic to the idea that we're searching for truth together. So that's another important phase about ideology, and then still one more I want to add back to the first point I made, that there's a deeper division within the academy and within the professoriate and on campuses between the Democrats and Republicans, the ever smaller percentage of Republicans. The deeper divide is between people who believe in that idea I described before, who believe in meliorism through discourse, through dialogue, who believe that people who see the world differently can nonetheless come together and find ways to improve their common institutions. Abraham Lincoln described the American project as being unfinished. And if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, I think he would say, oh my God, what an incredible improvement you guys have made in the last 150 years, but it's still unfinished. And if Abraham Lincoln were here 100 years from now, he'd probably say again, I hope, great job, you did it again, but it's still unfinished. It's again that deep idea that some people on campus hold that in fact it's possible to make your institutions better. On the other side of that, though, are people, as Jay mentioned, who don't believe in that, who come to campus and really think that power is everything. There's a simplified paradigm that we often talk about being the oppressor versus the oppressed, And that paradigm can be used to accommodate all different views. All good things go together is one way I sometimes think about that view. But the key part of that view is that it rejects the idea of meliorism. It rejects the democratic idea of working together through the rule of law principles to make our world a better place and the best we can, generation by generation. That idea has been challenged, as I said, by campus radicals, as Jay mentioned, but it's worth noting that it's not only people from the left who object that ideal, it's also people on the right who reject it. And a key characteristic of rejecting that ideal is by accepting this idea that power, when you have it, should be used. And if power, when you have it, should be used, the rule of law shouldn't be allowed to stand in your way, or you should bend your reading of the rule of law to allow the exercise of power in service of some more important ideal. And I don't know if Jay thinks that. I don't think he does. We'll push a bit more when we talk about the compact, which we haven't done yet. But I just want to put that little marker out there, or again, just still on that first question. Second question, which I can go faster on. When did I start?
25.
And what did you say?
Yeah,
I'm
right.
okay.
Yeah.
Second question, as I wrote it down, can higher ed reform itself, or does it need outside federal, state government influences? I just want to say to all of you about Heterodox Academy that at HXA we value viewpoint diversity. We're committed to that as an important principle. We're also practice what we preach about that principle regarding that question. So we have members of HXA in good standing who are active members who believe that universities should only be reforming themselves, who they truly believe that the way for universities to get better, the only way for them to get better, is by reforming themselves. We also have members in good standing who are active and enthusiastic members who are very excited about the Trump administration activities. They think that you need to have a government actively involved on campus. They've been waiting for the day of exogenous shock. That day has arrived, and God love them. They're members in good standing. So HXA members have diverse views on the question about the role for outsiders, governmental actors in particular. But what holds us all together, what holds the 8,000 professors together, is the belief that whatever you think about the external role of external actors, there's an essential role for internal actors. And the reason why the members of Heterodox Academy believe that internal reformers are a necessary condition of deep, lasting internal change is because we recognize, having lived in universities ourselves for years, that university institutions are complex, dynamic systems. So it says there are certain kind of organizational structure that require and limit what kinds of change agents can be effective within them. And one way to do this is through Friedrich Hayek. Hayek distinguishes two forms of social order. One he calls taxis, which is a made order. Some social orders are the kind of things that are put together in a certain place by external reason is exerted on these parts and puts them into a space. An analogy might be a Lego model. Let's say the Lego model of the Death Star. How well does the Lego model of the Death Star, how well have you built the Death Star Lego model? My kid has this, so I know this. My kid used to have this. Well, you look at the picture on the box, and you read the pages and pages of instructions, and if rationality applied to the instruction, to the pieces in front of you in the pile, is effective, you will have a model of the Death Star that looks like the picture on the box. You've done it. Some orders are like that. They don't have internal principles of change. They're not constantly dynamically interacting with one another. They're not counteracting. They're just there to be worked upon. The other form of order that Hayek described is what he called cosmos. And cosmos is something like a dynamic system. And a cosmos, and an example that Hayek uses is of a cluster of rock candy crystals, so on a string. So there's principles of molecular change that describe and predict how molecules will act at the molecular level. When you drop the string into a solution and start cooling it down, no one can predict what the exact structure is going to look like in the end. Dynamic systems are interacting with one another. They're complicated. To move a dynamic system is different than moving a static system. And if you see the universities, once you see the universities are dynamic systems, that urges great humility for anyone from the outside who wants to make changes upon it. I'm not saying that changes from the outside can't be made upon it. Even Hayek's own example, rock candy on a string, is an example of something like a made order on a different level, right? Because someone made a solution and put a string into it and made some raw candy. They set up the conditions for a spontaneous order to build and grow well. But that's not the same as saying that this thing is like a Lego model. You just can adjust some pieces and you'll get what you want. It's a very different thing than that. So I just want to point that out, that Hayek, who, as Jay I'm sure knows, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan. He urged caution, great caution and humility regarding people. He was on the left, coming and trying to manipulate the economy. But so too, he'd worry about what he called the fatal conceit, the conceit that rules can change dynamic systems in the way that they intend. He would worry about impositions, attempts to use that from the right as well. I'll give one more example, again, from the classical liberal literature. Again, a conservative great, who I'm sure is well-read among my friends at Heritage, Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer, writing in the 1850s, gives us a famous example about spontaneous order and the attempt of governments to change the spontaneous order in a society. And his example is of a metal plate with a dent in it. He says, imagine you're given a metal plate with a dent in it, and you want to fix it with your hammer. That's the government. What do you do? And Spencer described, well, you take it and you bang out the dent. When you bang out the dent, it turns out that the dent went a little too far the other way. So you flip the plate over and you bang out the little dents. Those little dents now make other dents on the other side. So you turn the thing over and hit it on the corner. And he goes on about how once you start getting into a dynamic system, you're going to have unintended consequences coming at you from every imaginable direction. It's very difficult to move a dynamic system in a particular direction you want through specific rules. What about the Trump approach? Or what about, is this the third question? About the Trump approach? We can say more about this in the open conversation. I would just say that first, there's an extremely important role for government regarding our institutions, our university institutions. There is an extremely important role for government to look for things like rights violations. Ever since Vannevar Bush, there's been an extremely important role in the American educational system for funding universities and funding research. There's also ideas of equality or equal opportunity to do with higher ed funding from Pell Grants and so on. So there's an extremely important role for government. But those are very general things. Those are things that in my mind are akin to putting the string on the pencil and dipping it into the solution. When you try to get into the more specific attempts to change things, you get pushback. You get bendings happening in directions you don't want. So I also want to point out that there were things happening because of external pressure that weren't yet governmentally imposed before Trump came in the second time. So there was a whole movement of people, and partly forced on university administrators against their will, because they're reluctant people. They are a thick-necked people, as they should be said. There were reforms happening before Trump came in the second time that are pretty substantial. One of the big things HXA pushed on with our friends at FIRE and at the AFA was institutional neutrality. And we developed a model of this that was an updated version of Calvin that made it a little more aware of the objections that neutrality would be likely to encounter in these postmodern times and on postmodern campuses. And 150 campuses adopted institutional neutrality before Trump came back into power again, including the UNC system, which did it in a really interesting way, by the way. It's kind of a model of a way to move a policy through from the inside. In the compact, which maybe we can talk about in the discussion, there are some features within the compact that we find very worrying at HXA. For example, requiring institutional neutrality as a requirement. Sorry, requiring institutional neutrality. I'm not sure it's going to pass constitutional muster. Jay and I can talk about that perhaps. I'm skeptical that it will. I also think that if it's imposed that way on a complex dynamic system, you're going to get even more pushback, more unintended consequences than you would if it's imposed by a group of faculty, like HXA members on many campuses, pushing this stuff through. Even that led to pushback and dynamic repercussions that were complicated and not easy for our members. But that was nothing compared to the pushback you get for institutional neutrality brought on the heels of a particular administration, which is widely unloved, by definition apparently, within the academy. So I'll stop with that for now. I guess the big points I wanted to make were two. First, about that first question, that every institution is always in a process of becoming. This is part of what it means to be a human being. to be on this earth at this time. And I can say that comment about that on this earth at this time, at any time, for any person throughout all of history. We're all living through an experience where we contribute or we don't contribute. You join the Alumni Free Speech Alliance or you don't join the Alliance. You do or you don't do these things. And universities are in that same situation. So that feature of universities and every institution is an extremely important one. And along with that, the second point I want to really emphasize is that the nature of universities is very much a complex dynamic system. If we're going to attend to our universities, to play our role as good citizens in this generation, to make them better, to move them in a positive way, we have to be very thoughtful about what it means to be working with a complex dynamic system. How do we adjust things so that the molecules on a campus adjust in ways that build something positive, rather than adjusting in ways that present positive things from being built? That seems to me as a great challenge in front of us. Government has a role, but it's all too easy for the government to be like Herbert Spencer's sledgehammer, banging away, bending things out of shape, and then the repercussion when the rebound comes is going to be worse than we hoped. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you both. So the way that I'm going to run this discussion is alternate between a question from me and a question from the audience, because I want to leave a lot of time for y'all, because I have a feeling this is going to be a lively discussion. So I'm going to start with a question that is dear to my heart because I work on state policy reform, and that is, how should we think about the distinction between public and private universities, and where do state legislatures and state-appointed or elected trustees come into play? Are these internal actors, external actors, and is their role different from that of the federal government?
You want to go?
I'll take a piece of this.
Okay.
So there is this really interesting problem about what counts as internal and what counts as external. I was doing this similar debate at MIT about 3 weeks ago. We spent a long time talking about that, trying to define our terms, which is kind of an MIT kind of thing. One way to think about internal, external is that internal actors are actors who, let's say, live and work on campus or have direct fiduciary responsibilities to that campus. That's one way to describe it. So we can run out the administration, students, professors, and some others, trustees, obviously. And then external would be people who don't fit into those categories. So alums fall into the external category. And then you have sort of quasi, and government actors also on the outside. So if you divide it that way, what's interesting to me about that way of setting it up is that you see that there's a great range of external actors that can play a role on this internal complex dynamic system. And there are different forms that their kinds of control or effort can produce directly affect the kinds of changes they can make. And it affects the kind of rebounds that happen as well. So an alum, for example, or a group of alums have a kind of quasi-internal character, even if they're outsiders, that the government agent doesn't, especially if it's at the national level. So the more localized, the more connected, may be closer to the place and may have a smaller reaction than alums from farther away, groups from farther away. Jay, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think the simple way to think about this is that there are owners of institutions. They're owned in a sense, and public universities are in some sense ultimately owned by taxpayers and legislatures. Now, those taxpayers and legislatures delegate authority, but ownership ultimately goes back to taxpayers. With private institutions, there's a board, and the board is the owner. And in both arrangements, faculty are employees who are granted autonomy and responsibility only at the discretion of either the board or taxpayers. And they're granted that autonomy because it's widely believed correctly that promotes better universities. But it's a grant of autonomy that's conditional, right, and can be rescinded or modified. And that, in fact, I think is what we're seeing. And just one other kind of quick quip on this. In 1999, I was on a trip in China, I was part of a U.S. Department of Education delegation to promote private education in China because the U.S. Department of Ed thought that private schools promoted democracy in China. Right. Here, not so much. There, yes. Okay. So we were there and we toured all these schools, and let me tell you, trying to figure out what was public and what was private was a completely disorienting experience. So we toured a private school that was owned by the Ministry of Defense. That had to, every school has to teach the state curriculum. I mean, I couldn't figure out what was public, what was private. It made no sense. And it's not quite that severe in US universities, but there is something a little bit like it, which is US universities, including private ones, have made themselves so intertwined with the government that their autonomy is infringed on quite considerably by that, because that money has always been conditional, always. And so there's no like virgin snow period before Trump where conditions weren't being imposed. They've always been imposed by the government. It's just a question of which conditions. Now, universities can extricate themselves from that if they just walk away from the money. They don't want to, which I totally understand why they don't want to. But then if you're going to take the money, then you have to take the conditions, and you have to live with the fact that those conditions can sometimes be bothersome.
Can I just add a little to that? So there's just, some of you may know this, but I want to just share it anyway, because it's a piece of history that matters. So in 1915, we were trying to figure out, as a society, in the process of becoming, what a university is and who owns it. And people didn't know. The AUP released this famous statement then about academic freedom. And one of the things they said was, it was in part triggered, the statement was in part triggered by some happenings at Stanford University, where Jane Stanford, who had given this university, she gave it, she owned it. That was what people were thinking. Why? Who else would own it? She gave it to them. And she wanted a professor fired, and there was a big hullabaloo about that. And a group of professors created this organization to say, you know what, universities have this special characteristic. They may be legal sense in which there's ownership, but there's going to be what the AUP described as like a public trust. That universities are going to be granted a certain degree of autonomy to govern themselves because they play, their highest purpose is to aim for knowledge and truth for the benefit of society. And in that 1915 statement, I just want to add, which is the beginning of academic freedom, is self-governance, which is one of the really interesting features of being a professor these days. In that statement, though, AUP said, if the professoriate misuses this power we're delegating to them, this special privilege we're giving to them, society's going to be granting to them, to govern themselves in normal times, if they violate those responsibilities, they should be aware that others will come in to take over the responsibility for them. Others who are less sensitive to the delicate balance, I'm adding now, delicate balance within the university, and who may come in with sledgehammers like Spencer. Now I'm really riffing on this. But this 1915 AUP statement that if you want to look for something great to read, that's a wonderful statement about what the role of trustees is, who owns universities, and what's special about a university within a free democratic society.
So just one, so I know, but we'll never stop. But one quick,
we have to have them yield together.
I know. One quick historical note about that 1915 incident at Stanford is that the professor in question that Jane Stanford wanted to fire was a eugenicist railing against Chinese weakening our genetic stock.
Yep.
And now perhaps because of her interest in railroads and the importance of Chinese workers in the railroads, or simply perhaps because she was a decent human being, she thought this was vile, that a professor at Stanford was denouncing Chinese as inferior genetic stock who were polluting America, and she wanted him fired. And you know, keep in mind again, today, that we similarly have vile bigots in the professoriate hiding behind academic freedom when they're at institutions that receive money with conditions of compliance with civil rights. And they're not entitled to that money, and they're not entitled to their jobs if they fail in the performance of their duties.
All right, so we'll head to an audience question. I saw you first, so go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you guys so much. This has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed listening to your remarks. Really made me think about a lot of things. I did have a question. I loved the invitation to check the text of the compact. It's,
Not the compact, the agreements.
oh,
I specified
Check the
the,
compact too.
but we can talk about, I didn't talk about the compact.
much
The
juicier.
But the agreements struck with Columbia, Brown, Penn, and University of Virginia.
okay. Well then, maybe this
I'll,
wasn't your...
I'll invite you to read the compact.
Okay, go
It
ahead.
wasn't your invitation, but
Yeah,
looking
that's fine.
at the compact,
Right.
I guess I had questions about whether either of you or both of you see a threat to academic freedom or just maybe concerns with two issues in the compact. The first is that institutions have to abolish or transform units that, among other things, belittle conservative ideas. That's the example. There are other things too, but one example is belittling conservative ideas. And the other one is that there have to be rigorous empirical assessments of the viewpoints of faculty and students, which sounds like I have to tell my employer my views on a series of issues, and they would keep track of that and then report it to the public. I was curious if either of you guys saw academic freedom issues with either of the conditions that it sounds like the administration wants. There are other conditions in there, and I think you guys have done a great job explaining how we can maybe separate them out, but those two conditions, do those seem like threats to academic freedom?
So I think the compact has points in it that go too far, and you're describing some. And I don't support it in its entirety. I think there are, but like a lot of things with Trump, you might think of it as a starting point for negotiation. That's the way he operates. You may not like that way of operating, but that's what he does. And so I can't imagine that universities, if they do enter into a compact, will agree to these terms, and I'm not sure that they can, given legal challenges. So I don't think we'll have to worry about it. So, I mean, this is the thing. A lot of academics, they're very worried people. They're very, they're very, very risk-averse, nervous folk, because if they were more risk-tolerant, they'd be somewhere else. But, a job with lifetime security, sounds really great to highly risk-averse people. And so they tell each other these scary ghost stories. They get whipped up about it and get very afraid about things. And again, if we just look at what has actually happened so far, what has been agreed to so far, which is in the agreements, not in a proposed compact, you're not seeing these scary things. And I strongly suspect if the compact is agreed to, it will not contain the scary things you're mentioning.
What's an example of a scary thing within the compact?
I think the provisions she mentioned.
Yeah.
Oh, the
I don't
conservatives.
think
Yeah.
they're scary. I
Well,
didn't mean to suggest
no.
I was afraid.
No.
Views on whether those things
But let-
are
Right.
threats to academic
Right.
freedom,
So-
or whether they fit within your conception of academic freedom. I guess I
Jay, may I?
could
I'm
Yeah,
gonna-
sure.
I'm going
Yeah.
to defend
Yeah.
something that you didn't defend.
Okay, sure.
So the way you put the questions in terms of academic freedom, I prefer to think about the conditions of open inquiry. Like, what's the experience on the campus? Are questions available? Are questions kept open in a lively way? That's what I really care most about. I think academic freedom is something more of a structural feature that lets you get there, or maybe it doesn't. But academic freedom stands in the way of open inquiry. I'm with open inquiry because we're about searching for knowledge. What I want to say about the belittling, I've written about this before, and I've said, and I believe that it's a huge mistake to try to legislate for belittling behavior. It's safe-based culture on the right. It's a form of DEI that anyone who cares about academic freedom and open inquiry should reject. I completely oppose that. But I just want to really point out that what conservative students face on many campuses has been completely outrageous. And it's gone on in the time of peak wokeness. That kind of acceptance of those kinds of behaviors is just a commonplace thing on campus. I remember, for example, I remember being at Brown and having three Republicans, the three college Republicans, or the leaders of the college Republicans, come to my office because they've been out in the main Greene with a table with handing out some Republican mainstream stuff. And students would go by them. These are like Brown students. They're nice kids. These are good people. But students would go by them and say things quite like racists, racist. And they felt embarrassed after a while being out there. So they packed up their stuff and left. And that's a small thing, so that's being belittled, right? I would say. But, there was something unconscionable about that. It's like, Spencer, looking at your plate, seeing clearly identifying a dent in it, and saying, I'm going to get rid of that dent. But, for a whole bunch of reasons, you can hear all kinds of other things coming around it. But I just want to point that out, that there's a problem that needs to be, for people who care about the internal paths to reform, there's a serious problem raised by what they're trying to reach for there, that we need to think about solutions for from the inside. Because if we don't, as the AAUP warned us long ago, others from the outside will come in and do it. And that's what we're seeing all across the academy. I think the gardeners of the Gardens for Curiosity, we, the professors, have fallen asleep in our sheds for too long. Fallen asleep, or else actively torn down walls that let the ordinary run of politics wash across these special places for curiosity. That's something that we're party to. And when I was belaboring the point perhaps in the beginning about institutions always being in a process of becoming, I mean to be putting responsibility on my generation, this generation of professors, many of you in this room, who allowed these things to happen for all kinds of complicated reasons that you and I could each spin out together over a beer.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question, and then I'll go back to the audience. So, John, you mentioned that government has a role, and Jay, you mentioned that there have always been strings. So I want to unpack that a little bit. Right now, we have accreditation, we have rules about student default, other strings. We have gainful employment. What sets apart these strings that we've always had that, there are gripes about accreditation, but very few people say it shouldn't exist, right? Very few people oppose gainful employment is bipartisan. So we have all these strings that are kind of, agreed upon with minor gripes. What sets these apart from the new conditions, to obey civil rights law and other things that the Trump administration is trying to do? Maybe there's nothing that sets it apart, or maybe there's something very different. So both of you, if you could address that question.
You want to take it first?
Sure. So I don't think there is anything that sets it apart. I mean, I think that everyone remembers fondly that Vannevar Bush, promotes the idea of federal sponsorship of research at universities, but he does it in a very clear context of, using universities to enhance U.S. national interest and in particular its war-making ability. Because this followed on victory in World War II, where the universities played a key role. Whether they could and would do that today is something that is in doubt, which makes public support of universities in doubt. So that was a condition. It was a political condition of that support. And there are research priorities set by federal research funding organizations. Those are conditions too. And then, more recently, we have DEI conditions, not only on which topics will be prioritized, but also the composition of the research team. Right. So the imposition of all sorts of, and then of course civil rights, compliance with civil rights law has also always been a condition since those came along. And so really we're now just haggling over which conditions. The conditions have always been there. You can't pine for a day when universities are left alone without conditions. They've always had conditions. It's just maybe you were more comfortable with some conditions than others and less happy about the current ones.
I think that's a great point. I'll just add to it that what I see when I look at the history and the current situation is that the imbalances, the ideological imbalance that I described, that big delta from 1960s to now, that very much affects the way university administrators respond to these external pressures. So when Obama writes a Dear Colleague letter encouraging universities to change their sexual harassment judicial policies, it's greeted with enthusiastic applause, and they overimposed a lot of the stuff. A lot of universities ended up being sued by them, and it's sort of been a disaster for a lot of universities and many people's lives as well. But when Trump comes in, or when Bush did some things, well, stem cell, for example, it was opposed every step of the way. Now, whether those two things should be opposed or encouraged, I'm not so sure, but we could debate that. But the fact that they weren't debated within universities that we just sort of reflexive in one way and then a different way, was all too predictable, painfully predictable, and a sign of the dysfunction of our universities. So I think we're aligned on that fact. I think the broader question, I think again that 1915 statement, which talked about universities being something special in a free society, something special in a democratic society, that has a role of aiming for knowledge, of preserving the best of our understandings. There's something about that carve out for this special kind of institution that's really worth attending to. And it doesn't mean that it's insulated forever by any means, but there's something about that mission, I think, which gives us direction from the inside as to what reform should look like. Because how do we know, those who advocate the internal side of reform, what you should reform to? There's lots of people within universities that have different views what the university should be. Many of them disagree vehemently with HXA. They're active on campuses and getting a lot of support until recently from their administrations. But what should those of us who want to reform universities for open inquiry, what are we steering by? I think we're steering by something like trying to realize that ideal. The university is a very special institution within a free and democratic society. It's a place for pause. It's a place where people come together as imperfect learners who show each other their imperfections, who come together, professors and students alike, to do this special thing for a little while. And that feature, that aspect of what we are, that understanding of what we might be, that's where power is from the inside of it. Again, that doesn't answer the question about whether they can do it on their own. I should also just say, just as an admission, some stuff that Jay said were even more true in my experience than he knows. Some of you I've talked to about this already. And I was talking to their chancellor this morning and told him about it. He's kind of one of them. Before Trump came in the second time, HXA had a lot more difficulty getting access to college presidents' offices than we do now. It's become a remarkable thing. My inbox is full. I was telling you, the Heterodox Heels, this a couple hours ago. It's full of messages from trustees and presidents wanting to talk to us. Where were they 3 years ago? And you could ask me this, right? And again, that's what role outsiders play. I can't answer that, but it is certainly it is the fact that presidents are now, maybe they're doing it because of social pressure, maybe they realize they've gone too far, maybe they realize that they were so busy building empires that they forgot to attend to the quiet thing about what happens in a dorm on a Tuesday night when there's no professors around, what kind of conversations are there, what kind of experience are students having on that campus. Maybe they forgot about that because they were still building other things and now they're maybe attending to it. I don't know. But I just want to mention that or admit that, whatever the word is.
Yeah, Marty.
What would a renewed deal between the university and the taxpayers of the state
I love
and the
that.
taxpayers of the U.S. look like?
I love that.
That is a win-win.
Wow, you did that so briefly. Do you want to?
I'll actually, fully channeling what Dr. Tomasi said, that I don't feel smart enough to know what that should be. Like I don't know how to centrally plan that new agreement exactly. And in fact, I think that this is the product of a pluralistic democratic republic system where we haggle over things and argue about things, which is why we're going to get proposals that are distasteful, and then there'll be bargaining and compromising, and it will be ever changing. So there is no kind of ultimately new compact. There's just continuing to haggle over it, but haggling now in different directions. And I don't know the ideal compact.
Well, I'll add a piece to that, if I may. There's a really nice piece by Danielle Allen at Harvard about this issue. And one thing Danielle argues or suggests is that if we move the reform efforts out of the executive branch and back to the legislative branch, there'd be the possibility of building a kind of consensus that could endure through time, or maybe more likely to endure through time. In part because in the legislative branch, done when it's functioning healthily, you get exactly the kind of disagreements and compromises and strange ideas that can be as part of that process that I mentioned of ameliorism, of working together with diverse viewpoints, not just using authority, which is an executive power. That's one way to describe the executive branch. It's power. if you simplify it. But in the legislative branch, you sort of see a more pure version of that liberal democratic ideal I was describing, of mutualism, different viewpoints in conversation, contesting, changing, and coming to agreement together.
Just one quick addition is my discipline is political science, and the norm within the discipline is to hate politics, hate it, okay? And I love politics. I love it. I like the messy debate and bargaining. I think it's actually good precisely because of this healthy process of ever becoming and the inability of anyone to be smart enough to know how to centrally plan it. So I like the messy haggling and bargaining of politics.
Are you worried about the executive overreach that people are describing the Trump?
Well, yeah, I mean, the executive branch is part of our democratic republic, and they're elected, and they have to have their power modified by the other branches, and so they're just part of that bargain, so I don't see that they're disqualified from participation simply because they're elected less often, and there are fewer of them that we elect.
Another feature of the compact is the requirement that universities who sign on to the compact adopt institutional neutrality. That's the idea of depoliticizing, where university leaders no longer make statements on controversial political topics. Briefly, it's enacted across the UNC system. Bravo to you all. Most people that I've talked to say that feature of the compact is a clear violation of the First Amendment, because it's saying to university leaders, your speech is going to be restricted. Is that obvious to you? Or do you think that's one of the contested? So as I read the compact, it includes some things.
Which is obvious?
Is it obvious to you that including the requirement of institutional neutrality?
That's not obvious to me.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But
I asked because I think it seems to me that there are some features within the compact that they're just obvious throwaways that there's no chance the courts aren't going to turn them over. They're sort of red meat to make the people come out and fight.
I'm not a legal expert, so I can't say. You probably know what the courts would likely say better than I do.
All right, so
They would never pass it.
Okay, then I defer to that.
So we were just talking about, executive power, and I want to talk about, a particular area of executive power, and that's the Office for Civil Rights. Currently, it has no teeth. If they catch a university violating civil rights law, they essentially say stop, and then they come back and they check the website. And now the website says this program is open to everybody, and the OCR says, all right, good job. So my question is this reasonable, or should OCR, through proper processes, be given more power?
Complex dynamic system. So whatever they do is going to impact and be affected by the nature of the system they're trying to affect. And if you have a system that's complex and dynamic, that's also ideologically balanced in a certain direction without any kind of counterbalancing going on, then we're going to get the kind of predictable things we've seen in the past, where Republicans get pushed back and Democrats, in effect, don't. So that's a version of, that's a brief answer to that. Do you want to?
I mean, I think that there are healthy checks and balances in our political system that, so that even a more active and vigorous enforcement of civil rights law, which of course will differ in its priorities and its interpretations from one party's administration to another, will still have to be accountable to courts and accountable to the electorate. And I think the reason why Trump is making so much headway in his efforts with universities is because he's on the 80% side of the 80-20 on these issues with the public. I mean, he's winning on these things because the universities did egregiously bad things, okay? And so they're in trouble ultimately with the electorate, which means that if you're a public university, you're in trouble, with your local electorate. And even if you're a private university, you're in trouble with a national electorate that still provides you with a giant amount of your funding. And this is the thing. Boards of trustees and senior leaders know this now. I mean, they were kind of, didn't think about it. They didn't have to worry about it before. They are keenly aware of this fact now. They know that they are dependent on political support to survive, okay? And so you could say, oh, it shouldn't be political. But of course it's going to be political. But that doesn't mean that Trump gets to impose anything he wants. He has to do things that the courts will let him do, and he has to do things that the electorate will let him and his party do. And so there are checks on that power. And the universities right now are on the losing side of a whole bunch of 80-20 splits. And so that's why they're losing.
We probably need a specialist in American politics to do this quite right, but I just want to note that I'm not sure about that. I read an article in the Chronicle in late October about a Quinnipiac study, a big poll, a big national poll, that showed that something like 62% of the electorate thought university should not join the compact. 62%. And that's something like, even among likely conservative voters, only half approved of the university signing onto the compact. Now, so that suggests that big numbers, big N's, are not with the compact. It might still
I'm
be
not
the
talking
case.
about compact. I'm talking about things like do you want to have the Hamasniks take over the university library? That's at 80-20, okay? The public's like, no, kick those kids out. You know, punish, expel them or suspend them, right? And the universities are, well, you know, it's part of developing as a person to engage in protest. I did it. It was really cool when we were in the shanty towns for divestment.
Right.
And now they're realizing, oops, we're on the wrong side of an 80-20 split. If we keep tolerating this stuff, we're going to get creamed financially and politically. And so they're going to have to rein it in, which is good, not bad. That means they're accountable to the people who ultimately pay them, which is the way it has to be. I mean, they can't be entitled to people's money and not expect that they have to answer for that.
I'm not a specialist in American politics, but I just want to add that I've heard from some of my friends who work in that area that when you read polls like the one I described, that doesn't accurately describe the dynamics of electoral strategy. That having your base be fired up is more valuable than having the 60-40 split or not go against you. And if that's the case, and it might well be the case, and some people in universities think about that, well then, if they're throwing some red meat into the compact, things they know they're not going to get through the courts, things that they know might be destructive that are going to, like Trump derangement syndrome or Harvard derangement syndrome, whatever it's going to be, that's done at the cost of whom? I think it's done at the cost of university members, people on university campuses, who are seeking to rebuild their universities and make them better. It's tough to make reform happen when people are able or empowered to criticize, for example, HXA or me, describing viewpoint diversity as a MAGA plot, that kind of. So when you get that kind of stuff tossed onto the campuses, into that complex dynamic system, it makes the internal path for making our universities better much more difficult. I'm not saying that we should be shielded from ordinary politics. We're not anymore. But there's something about that. Like, if we're trying to build a better world and build better institutions, what role does that sort of red meat throwing play? Democrats do it too. Don't get me wrong. But I worry about it a lot.
Yeah. Blue shirt.
Oh, hi. I'm a student at UNC. I'm a senior in history and econ, so this has been really interesting to listen to. God, I wrote down at least a dozen different questions so listening to me. But Jay, you mentioned about improper discrimination regarding sex and race.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't this partially irrelevant now with the Supreme Court case 2 years ago with UNC and Harvard versus students for fair admission? Because racial discrimination is now illegal, no affirmative action. And also, if there is sex or racial discrimination still continuing to the present day, wouldn't this best be resolved by the judicial system, like with Title IX, for example, and not by the executive branch?
So, yes, it's actually precisely because there was some ambiguity as to whether it was legal for universities to engage in the discrimination in which they openly engaged, okay? That ambiguity has been removed, largely, although not entirely. And yet there is still considerable indication of non-compliance. okay? And that non-compliance is widespread in part, again, because universities are run a little bit like hippie communes. And the people who make decisions don't care if they want to do it the way they want to do it for their agendas, and if it exposes the institution to legal liability, well, too bad. So there is good reason to, just as after Brown, there was widespread non-compliance. Schools did not truly desegregate for a good decade or more after Brown. We are similarly seeing widespread non-compliance today with Students for Fair Admission. And now, as to whose job is it to ensure that there's compliance, I mean, part of why you have an executive branch is to enforce the law. And they do it by telling people they're violating the law, imposing consequences on them, and then courts adjudicate these claims. And so that's a proper role for the executive branch to ensure compliance with the law.
Ask more of your excellent questions.
Right. Matt, I think you had a question.
I'm sorry, I tried to get you on.
Did you have a question?
In the white shirt?
Yeah.
Oh,
Plaid
yeah.
shirt. Yeah. Yes, you.
Thanks. I'm a faculty member in the history department. My question is, what can regular faculty members who don't have any sort of administrative power do to begin to rebuild public trust in universities?
It's a good question. I mean, look, I think organizations like Heterodox Academy. I know I was a little mean, but
No, you weren't.
But
I was expecting a lot. That was it.
But you know, I think joining organizations like Heterodox Academy are important because while external pressure I think is necessary, it has to be combined with internal reform. I mean, you need both. You need a tag team of a good cop, bad cop here to pull it off, and you want to be part of the good cop of Heterodox Academy within the university. And it'll also help moderate some of the excesses of the external pressure, which there will be some. And that will lead to a better ultimate outcome. So I think that if you want to help the public believe again in universities, you want to help promote the reforms where we can return to the truth-seeking mission of universities, which I think is why the public, thought that it was a good idea to hand their money over. Yeah.
And I'll just add that what we see on campuses, we started campus communities about 1.5 years ago now. So before we had individual members who weren't connected, we made them public so they were connected, made you all public so you were connected. Then we started building you into communities on places. And we see these communities now on campuses across the country and in Canada and now in England. They do a range of things, but some of them focus on events on campus. So we have a series called Heterodox Conversations where there's multiple speakers, not in a debate, but in a conversation, set up in certain ways to emphasize the role of the audience rather than the people on the stage. So some of our groups work on, we call it climate control, that affecting the way the campus temperatures by the kind of events they put on and the spirit in which they put them on. Others of our groups focus on policy, and they focus very much on reforming various aspects of the policies on their campus. For example, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, there was a climate science department with a bunch of HSA members in it, one of our interesting groups, and they developed a whole alternative to DEI within their department, service statements for hiring that were more closely tied to the strategic initiatives of their department. Because they were insiders, they knew how to do that. It took them about 1 year to get that through in their department. People opposed it, there was a big battle about it, but they brought people on board and it eventually passed unanimously within their department. So there's many other examples about policies that HSA people are working on. What we're finding now, in the new environment we're in, is that many college presidents are doing what their go-to move, which is creating committees for strategic planning or for open inquiry planning. And HSA members are prominently on those committees. We regularly meet with people who are on a number of committees at a certain universities that we're focusing on to help them keep abreast of what topics are being addressed by those committees, helping them with readings to make the committees see what an open inquiry perspective might look like. So there's a whole range of things. One other thing I wanted to mention is that I want to encourage the HEALs to do this more. One of the big surprises for us in creating communities is that they're membership drivers. My friends at Brown, who would be kind of like HXAE kind of people, and I would say to them, hey, I'm part of this group, you want to join it? They'd say, oh, it sounds really good, John. Nah, I'm not gonna join it. Which you probably had that experience with your colleagues. We find that once you create a community and start having events where you have some intellectual conversation about the Calvin Report or whatever it might be, you know, that kind of nerdy stuff draws professors in and they actually start to join. So joining is a really good thing. I got an email yesterday from one of our members at Western Michigan University who told me a while ago they're trying to recruit deans. I thought, why would you try to recruit deans? Apparently, according to what you told me yesterday, every dean at Western Michigan University now is a member of HXA. I don't know what that's going to lead, I have no idea, but that's among the kind of things that they do.
Okay. Other questions? John?
I attended, I want to tell this little story and you tell me whether this is typical of what's going on in the new administration. I went to a presentation by Harmeet Dillon, who's the Associate Attorney General in charge of the Civil Rights Division. And she said that she follows social media carefully at universities, and she saw a post by someone representing Turning Point saying that they had applied for a chapter recognition at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and had been turned down. And she just responded to the tweet by saying, this is interesting, keep me posted. Just because she did that, the university reversed their position and allowed the charter. Are we seeing that kind of informal influence?
I think that that's exactly the process I was describing, is that, that tons of reforms are happening in part because of the bully pulpit or bully X platform of the Trump administration. And sure, it's not fun to get beat up some, right? You know, it's unpleasant when you get called bad names and stuff. But it might help improve things. And so I think that it's going to be the line. Ultimately, it is a cultural change that we have to accomplish. This is, in the end, this is not simply a legal process thing. Right. This is short term. It's politics. Long term, it's philosophy and culture. And you know, people have to think about things. And so this short term bullying is going to help bring about kind of changes in what is possible for people to think about and discuss, and will lead to cultural changes.
Or the short-term bullying will bang the plate so hard that we
maybe
right. You know, for
Right here.
50 years.
Thanks. This was really illuminating. So, you know, Jay, I teach at a beleaguered institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and
which one?
You know, my sense is similar to yours of the excesses of the past and the need to address them. But what I've been really frustrated by and profoundly disturbed by is just the complete violation of legality, just the dispensing with any pretense of following the law. You know, in the Obama administration...
Well, can you think of something specific that you're referencing?
So, for example, if you want to pull federal funding from an institution for a perceived violation of Title VI or Title IX, there is a process, which you know much better than I do, but it involves first investigating to be sure that, in fact, a violation of the law took place, and then the funds can only be withdrawn from that unit within the university that is responsible for the violation. And what the Trump administration has done, and I believe there were violations.
Actually, I'm not sure about that last bit, but go ahead.
Don't worry, I am.
Okay, you are. Okay.
And what the Trump administration has done is it starts with the sanction, and then the university has to scramble. You can compare, for example, what the Trump administration did to say what the Obama administration did when trying to impose certain regulations within universities around Title IX, et cetera.
They had a Dear Colleague letter where they threatened them.
Yeah, which I found very chilling, but at least they followed the law. And so I guess as a fellow conservative, why aren't you more distressed by the complete disregard for law? Because here's the thing. Right now, we're dealing with what you might call right-wing populism. I wouldn't call President Trump conservative. Tomorrow, or 15 minutes from now, we're going to be dealing with left-wing populism. And President Trump has now offered the left-wing populists a playbook that they can also use to attack the universities. And then the result is that these great testaments to the genius of Western civilization are going to be destroyed, and it's because of both the right and the left.
So I have a lot of confidence in courts and the electorate. I do. I mean, the courts, to the extent that you are correct that the Trump administration has violated the law, then the universities will bring that and have brought it to courts, and the courts will decide, okay? And then also I believe in electoral accountability as well, which is to the extent that you begin to run roughshod over the law, the electorate actually has its own, it's not just elites who care about the law, people care in general. And that helps rein it in. At the same time, there may be some ambiguity about what the law actually entails and allows. And so until we have courts and electorates working these things out, I'm not as confident as you are about what is permitted and what is not permitted. The Trump administration says that they are freezing funds now. Is that term make any difference separate from withdrawing? I have no idea, but they claim it does. We'll find out. And keep in mind this. So I think that we don't know the law in its detail, independent of a process for adjudicating it.
Most people who I've read think that the freezing of the funding was clearly a clear legal violation of due process. So that's what I was talking about when I was describing what it means on that Western civilizational ideal to not take power and use it when you have it, but also show some restraint and respect to the rule of law. And that can happen from the left or from the right. I think it's happened obviously on the left, and that's what Hayek was concerned about, but it can happen from other directions.
Although the Trump administration has, maybe it did things out of order, but it has subsequently actually begun the formal processes for determining a civil rights violation, and through appropriate processes, depriving universities of funds. And then also there are other things that universities are vulnerable on, which are at executive discretion, like, for example, visas. And so universities have to be careful here. I understand you could say this is abusive for the executive branch to threaten to use their discretion not to grant visas to students, but that's consistent with the law. So politics ain't beanbag, and so universities should have been and need in the future to be attending to politics and not merely legal procedures, although both are important.
Well, thank you both. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight. Have a great evening.
There's pizza outside, right?
Ah.